Hi, I'm Troy.
And I'm Vicki. And we are Empty Nesters Wine.
Hey, thanks for joining us back again with our podcast. We are sitting in Empty Nesters Winery on Elmore Street as we speak. Make sure you like and subscribe to our podcast on YouTube. Like our Facebook page. We get a lot of information out through that. And we have a lot of people asking, are you open? When are you going to open? Try to put all that information on Facebook. So like our Facebook page. That's the communication page.
Us, yeah.
And then like and subscribe to our YouTube. And every Monday afternoon, we'll be releasing a new episode of our podcast. Today, we will be tasting our peach wine at the end of this podcast. Peach wine is currently in the works at our winery, one of our big batches.
But it won't be ready for at least a couple of years, so.
I think it'll be ready sooner, but don't tell her I said that.
Sure.
But anyway, yeah, so we have a peach wine that we did make a few years ago that we're going to taste today, and if all things go well with our big batch of peach wine, it should be similar. So we're back again with Paul Bahnmaier and Tim Rues. Last week I told you that Paul Bahnmaier is the president of the Lecompton Historical Society, and he had some really good historical stories for us last week, and I'm sure he has a head full of those again this week. Tim Rues is with us as well. He's the administrator of Constitution Hall, and again, he had a lot of really good stories for us last week, and they are going to continue telling us some stories of Lecompton and just the life in that time period. You know, they told us about Abraham Lincoln and some really good stories last week. And I think last week we were getting ready to talk about James Lane, our strawberry wine, the first wine that we made as a big batch as Empty Nesters Winery. We named Strawberry Lane. It's named after James Lane. I did a little checking into James Lane when we put him on our label, and it was really fun because sounds like one crazy person. But Tim really knows James Lane well because he reenacts James Lane's character in the Lecompton reenactments. So turn it over to Tim and let him tell us more about James Lane.
It's a pleasure to be at Empty Nesters Winery in very downtown historic Lecompton, Kansas, in a 1918 building that was constructed to replace the territorial period wood frame structures that were destroyed in a major fire here. So it's great to be in this building. It's beautiful in here, and we just want everybody to come to historic Lecompton, enjoy the businesses here on Elmore Street, and then take in our museums, historic sites. You can spend a day here in historic Lecompton and take in the great ambiance of history, Kansas history, right in this little community of Lecompton and Douglas County. One of the museums here in town is the Territorial Capital Lane Museum, and the Lane University started right after the Civil War. It was here in Lecompton until 1902. And the Territorial Capital Lane Museum, 3-story, 2 above, 1 below, limestone structure that started out to be the state capital of Kansas when Lecompton was the territorial capital. And then by statehood, everything moved to Topeka. But in 1882, the unfinished ruins of the territorial capital were completed for Lane University, named for Senator James H. Lane. Jim Lane, they called him, probably one of the finest stump orator speechifiers in Kansas political history. Jim Lane he was from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, downriver from Cincinnati on the Ohio. Started out as a Democrat, voted for the Kansas-Nebraska Act to open up the territories of Nebraska and Kansas for possibly slavery. Realized he had made a huge political blunder, so he resigned his U.S. House seat from Indiana, came out to Kansas Territory, and built his political career in Kansas Territory. Jim Lane had been a colonel in the Mexican War, So he had military experience, he had political experience, so he was cut out beautifully for Kansas Territory. This was bleeding Kansas. And he took his skills as a politician, as a military leader to Kansas Territory for the fight to make Kansas a free state. He lived in Lawrence, and even though he was not trusted, many considered him a political opportunist, but the man had a way of speaking. He was a great stump speaker. I mean, he could go into a hostile crowd, and 15 minutes into his speech, he had them all on his side. He was a very gifted politician.
So he was the Bill Clinton of that
Oh,
era?
yeah, he was, and Howard Duncan, our playwright for the Lecompton Reenactors, who wrote most of the scripts. I perform as Jim Lane for the Lecompton Reenactors. So bring a group out here, school group, adult group, and Lecompton Reenactors will perform for you. But Howard Duncan always used to joke that Jim Lane would write the script that Bill Clinton would follow when he got to Washington. And Lane had quite the reputation, but he was the consummate politician. Early on, he backed Abraham Lincoln for the presidency, did a lot of stump speaking in Indiana, his home state. He was a Hoosier, Illinois, into Chicago, campaigning for Abraham Lincoln. Of course, Lincoln wins. At the same time, when Lincoln goes to Washington to become president of the United States, also Jim Lane is heading to Washington, D.C., too, to become the first of 2 U.S. senators from Kansas. So Jim Lane got himself elected United States Senator from Kansas. And when Jim Lane got to Washington to visit his friend, the new president, Abraham Lincoln, he walked into the White House and was shocked to find there was no security at the White House. And, of course, Washington, D.C., at the time of the start of the Civil War, was surrounded by Confederate states, Southern states, slave states, Virginia in particular, Maryland, Delaware. So Jim Lane gathered up 110 former old Free State fighters from Kansas, and he issued them firearms, and they bivouacked in the White House, east room of the White House, for 8 days. They were known as the Frontier Guard. So Jim Lane basically saved Abraham Lincoln from assassination in 1861 with his Frontier Guard. And then later on, the Pinkertons and Secret Service took over for security. But so Jim Lane and the new president, Abraham Lincoln, were fast friends, good buddies, good friends. And all the political patronage flowed through Jim Lane. So he was the kingpin of Kansas politics. The start of the war, Jim Lane comes back to Kansas, and he decides he's going to raid into Missouri. And so Jim Lane is involved with a lot of plundering and jayhawking along the border with Kansas and Missouri. One of the reasons why Quantrell would come to Lawrence in retribution, hunting for Jim Lane in Lawrence, but he didn't catch him. When Lane is done raiding in western Missouri, former slaves follow him back into Kansas. And he takes it upon himself, unbeknownst to Lincoln, unbeknownst to Secretary of War Stanton, unbeknownst to anyone. He takes these former slaves and trains them to become the first Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. And Jim Lane's black troops were the first black troops to engage Confederates at a place known as Island Mound in 1862, late 62, and on the border with Kansas and Missouri, near Butler, Missouri, in Bates County, and that was the first time in U.S. history that black troops had fought against the Confederacy. They were Jim Lane's, and they defeated the Confederates, and that dispelled the notion that most people felt black troops would not make good soldiers because they would break and run under fire, but that disproved it. And also, Jim Lane pioneered what was known as total war, that Sherman and Sheridan would institute later on in the Civil War. Total war in that civilians are going to feel the Civil War. So he raided up and down the Missouri border, burning and pillaging, and Lincoln took notice of that and would institute that total war with Sherman, particularly his march to the sea. Jim Lane was riding high until his good friend, the president, was assassinated. Being the consummate politician that Jim Lane was, he sided up with the new president, Andrew Johnson, and helped him sustain a veto of Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. The radical Republicans in Kansas turned on Lane. Investigation began with his with some military contracts. And Jim Lane ended up committing suicide, shot and killed himself in 1865. So a lot of people think that because of his political skills that Jim Lane had higher aspirations than to be a U.S. Senator from the new state of Kansas. A lot of people thought that, he was presidential timber. And but anyway, Lane University is named for James H. Lane, the first of 2 U.S. Senators from the new state of Kansas. You go down into southern Franklin County, there's a little town called Lane, Kansas. That's where the Potawatomi Massacre occurred. John Brown and his sons and followers killed 5 pro-slavery men. And then you go out to western Kansas, the town of Dighton. There's Lane County out there. There's Lanesfield in Johnson County. So Jim Lane is a very controversial figure, but probably one of the most interesting politicians in Kansas U.S. history, if not national history.
Very interesting indeed. Yeah. He was very smart, very charismatic, and very violent, it sounds like. You mentioned something about when Brown was hunting Lane. Did he almost catch him one time at his residence?
Oh, Quantrell, you mean? Yeah, when William Quantrell. Yeah, I mean, William Quantrell and the 450 Raiders, they had a list of those that they wanted to get. And on the top of the list was United States Senator James H. Lane from Kansas, who lived in Lawrence. And he was at the top of the list because of his total war that he had waged in western Missouri at the start of the Civil War. But Lane, the raid started at 5 a.m. His wife woke him up. He jumped out the back window of his house and hid in a cornfield in his nightshirt. So he survived that. But Quantrell, he wanted Lane really bad. And supposedly they were going to take him back to western Missouri and burn him at the stake.
Whew. Well, good thing they didn't find him. Yeah, I always thought that was an interesting story about how he slipped out the window and hid in the cornfield. So, James Lane, we named our first wine after a controversial character. It was interesting. Paul told us last week about how, for lack of a better word, he weaseled his name into Lecompton history with the Lane University. It's a pretty good story. If you did not hear that story, go back to last week's podcast, and Paul told us all about that. So it was very interesting. Lecompton is steeped in history for sure, but I believe Paul has a good story for us of a more recent person and a more recent situation with Buddy Kellum. Paul?
Yes, history is being made all the time, and history doesn't just occur 170 years ago. 50 years ago, the last year of the Lecompton High School, in the fall of that year, they had an excellent football team. They went undefeated, and it was the first year of the Kansas High School playoffs. And Lecompton and 3 other 8-man football teams were selected to be a part of the playoff. Lecompton was to play Lucas, and Lucas won the coin flip for the home field, so the game was played at Russell. And at the time, they had a playoff system that if a game ended in a tie, it was based on the number of penetrations starting at the 20-yard line. So Lecompton and Lucas tied, and the decision started at the 20-yard line, and Lecompton and Lucas were tied at the 20-yard line. They were tied at the 15-yard line, and at the 10-yard line, Lucas had one more penetration. If they'd have been tied at that 10-yard line and had gone to the 5-yard line, Lecompton had one more penetration at the 5-yard line, and Lecompton would have been designated as the champion. Needless to say, this rule was changed and never used ever since then. But remember, that team was Marvin, we call it Buddy Kellum. He was an excellent football player. He received a track scholarship at Wichita State and then walked on with the football team. That was the first year that was the year of the plane crash. And because Buddy was not a member of the team as a walk-on, he was not on the plane. So therefore, he played all 4 years at Wichita State and developed his athletic skills. The first game that they played the following year was at the University of Arkansas, which is a long ways from the last game he played at Lecompton. He succeeded then in playing 4 years for Wichita State and walked on with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He made the team. He played there 5 years at Pittsburgh, and then was traded to the St. Louis Cardinals and played there 2 years and then retired. The thing that he made himself famous was that in the 1974 Super Bowl, he recovered the opening kickoff of the second half fumble. And the nationwide announcer said the fumble was recovered by Marvin Killam, who played 8-man football at Lecompton High School. So it was a nationwide recognition of not only Buddy, but Lecompton. We have a new display that's just been created at the museum, which is a lot of memorabilia of his time with Pittsburgh. We have his jersey and memorabilia of the football team at Lecompton. It's an excellent display and fabulous to come and see. So when you come to Lecompton and stop here at the winery or anywhere else in Lecompton, be sure and stop at the museum.
Definitely. That museum is, wow, they got a lot of stuff in there, a lot of really neat stuff. You could spend a couple hours just walking through there.
Right. Speaking of the museum, are you guys going to do your trees this year? I mean, can you tell us a little about the trees?
Well, we have 200 antique, vintage Christmas trees that are decorated with antique, vintage, collectible decorations. It's an unbelievable collection. We start November 1, and of course with the present situation with the virus, who knows what will be taking place November 1. But we have feather trees. You know, feather trees are over 100 years old, and the one that we have came from A.K. Winter's family. A feather tree is made of goose feathers, and they somehow stripped the feathers off off a goose and wrapped it around wire, and it's quite unique to see. If you have any interest in past Christmas, I would encourage you to come and see this unbelievable collection of ornaments and trees.
Yeah, you guys do a really good job. I like going in there and looking at them.
A lot of really interesting ornaments. I think there's some from all around the world, is there not?
Well, they're all local. I mean, they're American local trees, okay. But some of the feather trees came from Europe.
Okay, right. Very cool. As always, Paul and Tim are just a wealth of knowledge, and it's always, I could get caught up sitting here listening for hours to some of the things that they have to say, but I know that we do have to cut this short. Tim, was there anything that you wanted to?
I just, you've done a beautiful job with your building here and all the buildings here, the 1918 buildings, and it really adds so much to historic Lecompton to have you guys here, and it complements the history, the businesses, and the whole thing is just working out great, and you've done a magnificent job with this building. It's beautiful inside, and it's a lot of history in these buildings. I mean, 1917, they started to replace the 1916 fire that burned out all these old wood frame buildings, and these buildings are being preserved, and it's just a great thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and it's an honor to be a part of this town, the history, and like Paul said, we're making history every day, and just to be the next generation maybe from Paul and Tim, and to see all the groundwork that they've laid and put into this town is just really amazing. And it's funny that Tim and Paul both, I think, mentioned how there was a lot of wood frame buildings here at one time, and then there was a fire, and the fire burned a lot of it down in 1916, I believe. Then they came back in just a few years later and built these brick buildings. And I think you've heard us talk about this on other podcasts, but we do have that one exposed brick wall that Mason Vicky worked very hard on. I don't know, Paul or Tim, I don't know if you know this story, but when we came in and started this project, the building was oh, it was terrible. It was in terrible shape. And so what we had to do is just gut everything and start over. These brick walls had
Horsehair plaster about, I don't know, an inch and a half thick on them.
Yeah, and so we started pulling those down, and we found these brick walls under them. And the concrete was so bad in these brick walls that you touch it and it just turned to powder and fell out. So anyway, on the back wall, it's also brick. We hired a mason to come in and tuck that back wall, and he did such a terrible job. Vicky was not happy at all. So Vicky went to YouTube and learned how to become a mason, and she restored the brick wall. When you walk into Empty Nesters Winery and look to the left, you'll see a large brick wall dating back to when it was made. But yeah, Vicky restored that wall, sealed it up, and it's quite a feature. So, Paul, any final words about Lecompton or anything that you'd like to share with us?
Just to encourage you to come to Lecompton and see one of America's most historic towns. And as I've said before, economic development at its best is occurring right here in Lecompton, and this is what we're all about.
Definitely. And you heard us talk a few weeks ago about that economic development and how there are quite a few small businesses here, and we like to work with each other. And I say that I'm not really a part of the businesses yet. We're still opening, but we're real excited to work with the Historical Society, their tour groups. Aunt Netter's is a very good cafe. And, you know, if you're going to come and drink wine, you're going to want to eat. And Aunt Netter's is right next door to us.
And then you want to stop in at Kroger's and grab you some bratwurst to take home.
Yes, indeed. They've won awards with their bratwurst. We have Bald Eagle Mercantile right next door to us. If you're going to be here drinking wine and eating lunch, you got to go over there and look at all the antiques and different things that they sell there. Beautiful park right across the street from us. It's really a day trip, at least a day, and maybe someday we'll get I think we might have an Airbnb here, but maybe we'll get a small hotel or some kind of B&B here, and it'll be a 2-day trip maybe with that enterprising businesses. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I told you we was going to taste test our peach wine at the end of this one. So we do have a peach wine, not the peach wine, not the one that you'll taste when you come, but one that we made a couple years ago. It's been aging. I'm looking at this, and it's got a really pretty golden color to it.
Yeah, it's a little on the dry side for my taste, but it's pretty good.
Smells delicious.
It does smell really good.
If Vicky says it's a little on the dry side, that means I'm going to like it.
More of a semi-sweet, yeah.
That is very tasty. Yeah, I really like that one. The peach wine is really good. I've always liked our peach wines, so that's a very good wine.
Well, thanks again to Paul and Tim for coming out and talking all about the history here in town.
Next week, we're going to have a very exciting podcast, so tune into that.
Thank you very much, Charlie and Vicki. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you.